a groundbreaker for Indigenous women in leadership and a personal role model to me in my life and career. And it was with great admiration that I welcomed Dawn to the stage to give the plenary session address.
Terry had to say that, otherwise her mother would have a go at her. First of all, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and traditional owners, the Larrakia people. It's just great, the work that Larrakia are doing around Darwin. I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me to this really exciting conference, and I'm just delighted to be here. It's been a great morning. I only arrived here last night. I'm here in my role as Chair of Indigenous Business Australia, which is a Commonwealth statutory authority established to assist Indigenous peoples' economic engagement through building assets, developing business and home ownership. IBA has a strong involvement with and a focus on tourism. Around a third of our investments are held in tourism and hospitality assets. Nearly 10% of small businesses we support through lending and business advice are in this sector as well. Amongst IBA's tourism assets are some iconic ones here in the Territory, including Guggerju Crocodile Hotel, Cooinda Lodge in the Kakadu National Park, and a relatively newcomer in Wildman Wilderness Lodge in Mary River National Park, and in North Queensland, Jubbagai Cultural Park, which celebrates its 25th anniversary this year. We have also recently entered into a joint venture with Jarwin to develop Cicada Lodge, a new luxury accommodation at Nitmaluk, and it's just had a fabulous opening. Overall, IBA has tourism and hospitality assets exceeding $70 million in value, employing more than 400 people, and around 80 of them, 1 in 5, are Indigenous. But for my sins, I'm also Chair of Indigenous Land Corporation, which is in itself is building a strong presence in Indigenous tourism, and you may have heard the Honourable Martin Ferguson announce a $1 million grant to assist with the development and implementation of the Indigenous Business Quality and Skills Project for National Training Academy at Yulara yesterday. In May last year, the Indigenous Land Corporation acquired Ayers Rock for some $300 million and created the subsidiary Voyages Indigenous Australia. And this is changing dramatically the Australian tourism landscape. ILC has set a target of 50%, or some 300 of the staff, to be Indigenous by 2018. Then there is also Mossman Gorge in Queensland with an investment of $20 million, and at a peak season will employ 70 Indigenous staff. These are just a few of the many Indigenous tourism offers throughout Australia currently, and demonstrate that there is no shortage of investments, even though I heard from some people this morning that they were unable to obtain funding, but nor there is a lack of engagement of Indigenous people in this sector. However, as has been recognised by the organisers of this conference, we are at the crossroads for Indigenous tourism. The decline in tourism, the high value of the Australian dollar, the fast-moving 21st century and the digital age, lack of interest of Indigenous culture by non-Indigenous Australians, and tied product offer in some areas requires us to really rethink our approaches. Now, you would have heard some of the things that I'm going to say. I'll try not to repeat throughout the conference, so forgive me. And also forgive me for our international visitors, because a lot of my talk focuses on Australia. But, just let me digress for a moment to take you back to see how far Indigenous tourism has come. I have to say it's in my background as a museum director. And my mother used to say to me when I was going through a hippie stage, you never forget where you come from, Dawn, when I was sleeping on mattresses and building my bookshelves out of bricks and timber, but you don't have to stay there. It's important to look back and reflect on the past to enable us to move forward. So, I believe we've come a long way from the days of William Dampier, who published the first best-selling travel books about Australia around the reign of Queen Anne, and set the fashion for an unsympathetic press on Indigenous people. And although many would argue, and still today, sorry to say, that Dampier presented an accurate anthropological observations about Aboriginal people from the Kimberley, tall, slender, slight-limbed, heavily boned eyebrows, eyes troubled by flies, his perceptions were clouded by his European values. In an age where trade benefited one country at the expense of others, bourgeois and Protestants Christianity, naked heathens lacking goods for trade, and who neither farm nor husband animals, epitomised the negation of an ordered society, Dampier's contemptuous and often quoted dictum, "The inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the world," was to be echoed as a self-justification by the land takers for over 2 centuries later. When Australia's first European colonisers arrived to settle, they were often fascinated by the Indigenous inhabitants. Governor Phillip was intrigued by the Eora people of Sydney Cove and took some interest in their customs. He was one of the few early colonists to record the presence of Aboriginal art in Australia. We frequently saw the figures of men, shields and fish roughly cut on the rocks. Lieutenant Dawes made efforts to learn the Eora nation. Convict artists sketched the wild appearance and curious ornaments of local identities. Enterprising spirits like Bennelong became international celebrities. As the years went by, Europeans found many more things to fascinate them about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people: their profound understanding of the land and sea, their skill with tools and weapons, their spirituality, languages, kinship systems, and most recently, their art. Did Europeans realise that they were encountering a complex, ancient, sophisticated and enduring culture with much to learn, to teach them? How many recognised the value of that culture and the tragedy of its threatened loss? The sad answer is not many. As is still the situation in some sections of the Australian community, Aboriginal culture was held in low esteem, that it was commonly asserted that Aboriginal people held no religious or spiritual beliefs. Such a climate of opinion was unlikely to comprehend the supreme importance of particular sacred sites and places to the psychological well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Although Governor Phillip accepted the visual reality of Aboriginal art, many later writers doubted that any artistic talent existed and ignored its symbolic content, at best dismissing it as daubings of childlike minds. Confronted by the existence of major galleries with contrasting styles, such experts explained their form by reference to the intrusion of foreigners possessing superior intellect. The striking Wandjina figures of Kimberley art, for example, have been attributed to Egyptians, Hindus and the creatures from outer space. The influence of the Assyrians, Persians, Phoenicians, Greeks and Romans has been discerned at other places such as Cleland Hills rock engravings. It's interesting, isn't it? Even though now most Australians know that Aboriginal people were actually the creators of these rock art engravings, only the converted recognise them as being magnificent and striking and visit them. And even though most Europeans did not value it at first, Australian Indigenous creativity began to respond to the European presence from the early days of contact. Aboriginal weapons like boomerangs took on iconic status as Australian souvenirs and were created as decorative pieces for sale. The bark paintings of Arnhem Land, the dance machines and masks of the Torres Strait, the shell necklaces of Tasmania or the towers of Lake Eyre district became recognised as interesting and eventually valuable trade items, and thus took on a new meaning, sometimes quite different from the original. Subtle and intricate markings which had been used in rock paintings, body paintings or sand patterns since time immemorial were transferred to silk or hardboard or canvas. The Hermannsburg watercolour artists turned their knowledge of country into powerful landscapes. Painted boards carried in ceremonies in the Kimberley region evolved into a sought-after works on board and canvas. Ceremonial clay was turned into ceramics by fabulous people like Thankupi. Traditional burial poles were created anew as impressive modern sculpture. Continuing to make use of every available medium, Aboriginal artists are, of course, also working in web art, photography and film. We are now used to hearing that Indigenous artwork has fetched record prices in international auctions or seeing exhibitions of the works of many in our major galleries. There are hundreds of websites offering Australian Indigenous art to international buyers, and there is no longer an airport or a souvenir shop in the country without its share of Aboriginal tea towels, T-shirts or keyrings. What is absolutely fantastic is the real impetus is coming from the Indigenous side. Native people all over the world are reviving and are reinforcing their culture through traditional art forms and craft forms and creating modern works in order to reassert their place in the nation and offer a powerful alternative view of its culture and history. In the past, they were subjects of commentary by explorers and anthropologists. Now they are the authors, and from my perspective, what is most important is that the stories and the art are being consciously transmitted by the people who have inherited the right to do so. So, the challenge for those of us involved in Indigenous tourism is, how do we draw out the amazing and powerful inheritance of Indigenous culture? But before we can contemplate an answer to this, there are a couple of other practical issues and questions that we need to address. From where will all of our visitors come from the next 5 to 10 years? As many of you, and has been said in this conference over the last couple of days, we've seen a dramatic increase from places like China, and also we should not think about Korea, South America. So we need to really ask ourselves and really think forward about who is our demographics, who is our audience, who is going to be our visitor. And I think it's well known that the majority of visitors to the country don't necessarily just come from Indigenous, whilst we've heard from everyone who's in the Indigenous tourism business, they don't just come here for that. So therefore, how do we leverage off other opportunities to encourage them to come to Indigenous areas? We know, for instance, that India is also on the rise in terms of tourism, and they absolutely love their cricket. How do we leverage off those that are going to come? That's what we need to be thinking about. And more importantly, how flexible can we be? Can we be flexible enough to quickly change our offers? How do we engage more with our domestic market, given that we know in Indigenous areas that the Australian market doesn't necessarily want to go. You've got the few who are converted, want to come to some of our cultural offers. So how do we get them there? I do believe that we have the potential across Australia to create destinations in their own right. In the Northern Territory alone, there are a large number of destinations alone, and there are throughout Australia. In major towns and regional centres, the Indigenous cultural centres and sites can develop programs that will attract locals as well as visiting tourists. Training and develop assistance needs to be much more sophisticated and include visitor research and front-end evaluation of products and offers, cost-benefit analysis, including price points. So we do seriously need to turn... We're now looking at, obviously, in IBA and ILC at training, increasing the numbers of people employed in areas, but we now need to look at much further than, in addition to that, who is our market, who is our audience. We need to be so sophisticated. We've got a program, we heard about the digital and social media this morning, but there are some other ways in addition to that. For instance, we've got a program at the museum at the moment in one of our exhibitions where people just walking through the space, if they've got a mobile phone, we can pick up how long they stay in places. Now, I got a bit concerned about that, so I said we need to look at that. How does that go with private privacy issues? So they're sort of testing it, but what an extraordinary... And it doesn't tell us enough. We know that they stayed 10 minutes in front of a laced truck, but were there other reasons why they stay there? So we have to get much more sophisticated in how we use this medium. Visitors these days, and you've heard a lot about this over the last couple of years, are seeking an overall experience from the time they get on that plane or that bus or that train to when they arrive back home. So everything we offer, from the tour to the food, has to be thought through so that it's a total experience. They can have a wonderful experience in going and being shared as the stories being told. However, they then might have had some terrible food, or the shop might have closed before they could get there, etc. So we need to focus on that overall experience. Most tourists these days are seeking that more in-depth experience, as people have talked about. They want to take away that they've learned something new, that they've never had this experience before. And that this may mean that, as we heard it earlier on as well, using a different, and different sorts of mediums to do that. For example, the Egyptians now use, for the pyramids, they light up, you can have a lighting experience at night. There's this fabulous bloke who's been travelling around Indigenous communities in Australia, his name is Craig Walsh, who creates digital experiences. For example, in the windows shops at night, he creates an aquarium so that you can see the fish swimming around. He can create, in trees, the birds that might be there at night. So what this does, the digital and social media does to enhance the storytelling and the culture, can be quite phenomenal while maintaining the integrity of the ownership and the inheritance and the traditions of the traditional owners and others. But we certainly need to explore these opportunities, and collectively it can be much more cost effective to do this. The audiences we need to look at, it's no longer can you look at, well, we're going to get this group from China, or we've got the grey nomads coming around Australia. We need to look at breaking that down even more. What are those grey nomads broken up into? Well, there are some people in there who are conservative, they don't like confrontationalist sort of films. There are others who want to hear that sort of background. There are families coming whose children really want some, digital experience or social media, or might want an interactive. So you need to start to break down even further who the audience is and who what their views are, and you can track that over time. And it does not mean that you lose the integrity of the culture and the traditions. It's just that, as I tried to paint for you, where we've come from, we Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders have adapted and changed in a way on our terms, even though some people have appropriated some of our culture, but we have adapted, we have changed, but we still have retained our strong heritage. So we need to look at that and focus on that and accelerate it a bit. Most of all, people want a narrative. They want to hear that story. They want to hear where that dance came from. They want to know about the language. We need to recognise that we each have a responsibility not only to our own clan groups or our own area, but most visitors might only visit your particular space. Therefore, you represent all of the Indigenous people in the country. So we should treat ourselves and recognise each and every one of us that we're a gateway into and an insight into Australian Indigenous culture and heritage. We need to bear that in mind and be more mindful of sharing with each other and allowing each other. And a good example was this morning, whilst didgeridoos aren't played around Uluru, but some tourists will only come there, is that not allowable? I think we need to look at some of those issues and not be critical of each other for doing that. So it's important that they have that story and they want to hear some of the bad news and some of the bad and sad stories, as well as the really happy ones and celebrations of Aboriginal culture. So people do want to hear that story. They want to take away something that is new. They want to also recognise that there's something with each and every one of you that they themselves have experienced. So my ending is that most people are looking for a narrative. And for me, what better place can they find that wonderful narrative that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years than Indigenous Australia? Thank you.